Coming up on today's TechSNAP, the Sony Online Network was also breached right along with the PlayStation Network, and the details are even more fascinating. Plus, it looks like the entire thing could have been very easily prevented, and Sony was warned ahead of time. We'll tell you all about that. Then later in the episode, the EU is passing a law to make browsing the web practically impossible. I don't think they understand technology, and we're going to tell you why. And then we'll wrap up the episode with a postmortem on Amazon's outage. Not only do we know the very, very easy mistake that caused the entire thing to happen, but we'll look at the cascade failure that caused the outage to be so severe and what they're doing to make sure it never happens again. All that and more on today's TechSNAP. Hi everyone, and welcome back to TechSNAP. My name is Chris, and joining me on the line is my co-host, my co-geek, Alan. Welcome back, Alan.
Hey, Chris.
And now, some people, since TechSNAP's new, I'm going to do this for a little while. I'm going to introduce Alan. And just so for you who are new to Alan and the show, he is a former college professor, a longtime teacher of network engineering principles and things like that. And he also is a longtime IT admin like myself. We both have years and years of system administration and network engineering experience, and we're taking those war stories and all those experiences, and we're focusing them on the content and topics in today's show. So, Alan, we got to say, we kind of boo-booed. We asked everybody to email us, and nobody did, because we didn't give them anything to email us about. So, it's going to be my goal in this episode that by the time we wrap this episode, we'll have a reason for people to email techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com. So we want to start incorporating feedback. And one other plug is we do have a live stream over at jblive.tv, and we're live at 1 p.m. Pacific. And you can get in the chat room and give us your thoughts live as we do the show. All right, Alan. That's all the business stuff I have. There has been, when we did last week's show, there had been a lot of information regarding this whole PSN network breach stuff. Now, as the week has gone by, we've got a lot of more details about that, but also a whole new Sony Online Entertainment Division breach that took out games like EverQuest and things like that for hours. I mean, and millions of more account information has been stolen. Alan, I know you've collected a lot of the interesting bits of details. Why don't you lay some of those on us?
Sure. Well, the first thing was that when the PlayStation Network was hacked, Sony came out and said that the Sony Online Entertainment part, the PC version, is an isolated system, and it was fine. But as we've learned in the last few days, it turns out that it was compromised at the same time, back on April 16th or 17th, which is even earlier than they said the PlayStation Network was hacked originally. So they thought it was more like the 19th, but it was more like the 16th. And they didn't break just the PlayStation Network, but they also broke SOE at the same time. So the systems were obviously not as isolated as they said they were.
Wow. Yeah, they say, they have a quote here in the article that says, while the two systems are distinct and operated separately, given that they are both under the Sony umbrella, there is some degree of architecture that overlaps. The intrusions were similar in nature. This is not a second attack. New information has been discovered as part of our ongoing investigation, and they believe this is related to the same other breach. So they said, well, there's some architecture that's shared. It's, architecture.
Right. Well, we'll get to that in a few minutes.
Yeah. I have a few things to say about that, but yeah, continue on, sir.
A couple of the highlights are a database of credit cards. An old one from 2007 was compromised, and so they know for sure this time some credit cards were taken. And that includes the credit card, expiry date, the name on the card, and a bunch of other stuff, as well as some direct debit accounts in Europe, especially Germany and so on. That is slightly worse because those type of accounts don't have an expiry date. So they're still valid now, most likely. Not all of them, but most of them are probably still valid. Right? Your bank account number doesn't change like your credit card number does.
Oh, boy.
So the first question is, why was old data from 2007 not properly destroyed or stored securely? Right? Just because it's an old database of credit cards doesn't mean you just leave it laying out in the open.
Yeah. And
it wasn't, posted on their website, but it obviously was not secured like they claim they secure.
And was it even necessary for them to have some of those,
Probably not. Not that old.
Right. Exactly. I think this is a this is as this story as we learn more about this story. I think this is becoming such an obvious catastrophe that could have been avoided.
Yes, mostly it looks like they were woefully inadequate security, and they were just not concerned about it at all.
Did you see that story that they were supposedly warned in an open forum regarding
that was what I was going to talk about. Apparently, they've been running older versions of some software like the Apache web server.
Yeah.
One that was known to be vulnerable to a specific attack that was in the wild, and they were warned 2 or 3 months ago by security researchers saying, your stuff is vulnerable, you need to fix it. And they just ignored it and were still running it. And so, like they were trying to say, it's like even though PSN and SOE are isolated, they both ran old versions of Apache because we couldn't be bothered to keep up with security updates.
And Alan, I think the interesting point to mention is this information came out, and unless you kind of quickly mentioned, I didn't catch it, that it was from a hearing at Congress that Sony just neglected to attend, but the security research firm on their behalf did go and said that not only was it public, but they've been warned, and they said that in front of Congress, which is kind of fascinating.
So the U.S. Congress was having hearings about this issue, and they had some university professors come in and talk about what it was that Sony wasn't doing, and the security experts that had warned Sony months ago on a public forum that you're running outdated software that's compromisable. You need to fix this, and Sony just ignored them. I think part of it is that big companies don't have a way for people to contact them easily.
And
right?
they
If
don't,
you're not a customer of Sony, how do you get this information to them?
And they don't know how to process information that comes from the outside like that. Like upper management doesn't understand how to gauge the validity of a statement like that, or how to gauge its impact on their systems to know if they need to assign the resources to act accordingly. So they have to have a system in place where employees can be engaged with an outside community. They can take that kind of information and then bring it inside, maybe validate it first, and then they need to have a system in place to work up the chain to the point where they can get the approval to make, obviously, for whatever approval it was that they had to get to update their Apache installations. I mean,
it seems in this case that it was, right? They went to the Sony forum and, told the moderators about it. I think so. They're supposed to be the representatives to the community. But security researchers shouldn't have had to go to Sony and tell them you should update your Apache because it's vulnerable, right?
Amen to that.
It's like, Unix Administration 101.
That's
sign up for the mailing list for the software you use and get the vulnerability disclosures.
That's part of the job of a system administrator is keeping those systems up to date to avoid, I hate doing it for even just for Jupiter Broadcasting, for example. I updated to the latest version of WordPress last night. Now my approach is usually I wait a couple of, maybe a week, as long as I can. But I hate doing that kind of stuff. I don't want to break my website, but you got to do it.
And especially with something like a giant live service where you have to, test out the new software, stage it, make sure it works, and then gradually deploy it.
I guess the issue is...
when it's a critical zero-day vulnerability, you have to act or you risk being compromised.
And you, if whatever it takes, maybe you architect in a way so that you have, if something like that happens, you have less exposure. But the other thing is, and I realize from a regulatory standpoint, getting people to regulate technology implementations, any government, and especially one that's worldwide, a company that's worldwide would be really hard. But you almost kind of feel like they shouldn't be allowed to store this type of information unless they can prove that they have a process to keep their systems secure. It's kind of like putting all of my details into a bank, and then that bank vault not having a lock.
Right. There are laws about things like that in some countries. Like in Canada, we have the Personal Information and Privacy Protection Act, or PIPEDA it's called, and it details the steps companies have to take when they're storing your private data. But it's slightly dated, and mostly it's talking about, keeping your filing cabinets in a locked room, but it does have some provisions about electronic storage of information.
In some states
but
here in the US...
the hardest part is that governments are really bad at regulating technical things because they don't understand them, right? The people writing the law don't understand what's happening. And even if then they consult with outside people, when they don't understand what those people are saying, they're just getting a simplified view of it, they always seem to mess it up.
Right.
And that's one of the stories we were going to talk about later.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting, depending on what state. I just one thing is kind of just speaking about governments protecting identity is there's some, like California is working on a new digital privacy law, and there's some states, or maybe one state in the U.S., Alan, where if you're in that state, Sony by law has to cover.
You were reading the notice from Sony. They have a different version of the notice if you live in Massachusetts.
Right.
Because a law there requires that during a data breach like this, the company who lost your personal information has to pay for your for a identity theft monitoring service for you for a certain period of time. Someone that will, watch your credit reports and notice when someone might be trying to steal your identity.
Yeah. Maybe that's something we'll look into someday. There's a question for you. Email us, techsnap@jupiterbroadcasting.com. Would you like us to look into legitimate ID protection or what? I mean, it's an area, as this stuff happens more and more, I'm getting worried about.
Companies should be required to pay for it for you if they lose your data.
Yeah. And
But
do
really,
you have any, I've heard, what is it, LifeLock or whatever it is, but do you have any legitimate ways that you monitor and protect yourself that don't cost you a bunch of money? Let us know. I'd love to know. I'd love to know. I'm in all of these things that have been breached lately, I'm in all of them. Every single one of them. Like there was the story we're letting, we kind of take, here's a great example of our approach on TechSNAP. Today before we started the show, a story about LastPass has broken. And I'm an avid LastPass user. I've recommended it before. And it's a story we're following closely. But honestly, the details are so new that I think, Alan, you agree. It's our approach on this show is an in-depth technical analysis.
Yeah.
So we're going to wait till there's more information.
Analysis. So,
but
maybe next week we'll have enough details that we can explain what actually happened.
But there's another service where I use and it's possibly been compromised. Couple of quick notes before we jump on from Sony. I saw somewhere, I don't know if this is true, but I believe it was from a fairly well-known source or reputable source that some of the initial signs, that some of the things that alerted Sony to the fact they were even compromised in the first place was they didn't know until their servers just simply started rebooting on them. Did you see that? I read that. And then
I didn't see that specifically, but
the other thing, but
it
it's
seems
funny.
like they had no clue what was going on.
I've come into places before where they have called me in because their internet is running horribly slow and their FTP server was hacked. And the way they just found out was somebody just started using up all their bandwidth.
Yeah,
and
that's the only way that they knew.
Mm-hmm. One other thing that I think is interesting, it's like hindsight's 2020. Hey guys, is that Sony says they're now adding automated monitoring and encryption. And
why didn't they already have that?
There's free things out there like Snort and Tripwire. Snort will let you monitor at a network level, and there's probably even better tools now.
Yeah, it monitors at a network level and looks for patterns that are known attack vectors.
And then Tripwire, which I honestly haven't used in quite a few years, but back in the day, when I worked for a bank, I used Tripwire, and
it looks for modified system files. Yeah,
and it's awesome. It sends you reports and all kinds of stuff, and these are open source and free and available.
Yeah. Now, when you have a lot of servers, sometimes Tripwire can be a bit of a pain.
There's a commercial package, though, that gives you a complete dashboard, things like that, and lets you roll out changes and stuff.
If you use Bacula, the backup service, it has the ability to do a Tripwire-like verification of your files, and you can let you centralize it so you can compare all your machines at once and get a report. And
before
it
we
also
get
does
off
cross-platform.
This is an after the show thing, but I don't want to forget. Before we get off the show today, I want to talk to you about Bacula, because I'm ready to pull the trigger on Bacula. So I want to talk to you about that. But why don't, before we get all onto that, because I'll get all distracted if we start talking about backups. But you'd kind of teased it a little bit. This has been really, the Osama bin Laden story has been probably one of the biggest stories in a very, very long time, and it's absolutely not TechSNAP's beat. So we're not really going to get political on you and things like that. But
there were some security things happening here.
Alan, this is freaking fascinating. Take it from the top, man.
So it seems the U.S. knew about this compound and that somebody was hiding there at least since last summer, maybe even since 2006. Now, they weren't entirely sure who was in the compound, but it was some high-value target. They thought it might be Osama bin Laden, but they weren't sure, and they didn't want to jump the gun and risk letting the enemy know how much of their security had been compromised.
Now, before people freak out, why are we talking about this on TechSNAP? There's a very interesting tech angle to it, Alan. And I don't want people to get their fears all up in a tussle. So from the start, why don't we say that it seems like the main thing that we're taking away from this is there's certainly a possibility that the WikiLeaks site was directly responsible for accelerating this mission to some people are saying a much faster pace, because WikiLeaks cables were released online that obviously seem to leak information the government might be aware of their location.
Right. One specific one was about the interrogation of a courier that had been captured. And he had information about other couriers who regularly transported documentation back and forth to Osama bin Laden.
And Alan, being the consummate researcher that he is, actually has a direct link to that leaked cable in the show notes if you'd like to check it out to read it for yourself. But
so basically, it became the classic intelligence paradox. So we have all this information about this courier network, and we think we might know where Osama bin Laden is. But if we go there and he's not there, and somebody else is or whatever, or we somehow miss him, we've now given away the fact that we know this. Right? And so we can't get any more information by following the other couriers and see where they go.
Right.
Right? So
and they would probably move him and
right.
Yeah.
So the classic intelligence paradox is you have this information, but you can't use it for risking exposing your sources and methods.
Right.
Right? Because once they do this, they know you were following this courier or that courier, or you were listening in on their phone calls or whatever it was. Right? So when you use intelligence information, you're risking the fact that by doing that, the other side will know how you got the information. Right? So sometimes you have the information, but you can't act on it because you risk not getting further information later.
Right. Yeah.
So what happened was WikiLeaks released a bunch of documents from Guantanamo Bay, about 780 of them or so. And in one of them, it talked about this courier, and he specifically mentioned moving to Allahabad, which is where this compound was, and acting as a courier. And so when that was released, the U.S. was basically, they had to either act now or risk the fact that the other side would hear about it and move or change their plans or change their security arrangements.
Right. And why I find this particularly interesting is it's not the whole leak of intelligence angle of this. That's been going along long time, way before I was ever born. But I think the whole posting something online and having it immediately distributable to the world is a completely new way to F with these kinds of operations. And I'm not necessarily one that sits on the fence and thinks it's a bad thing. I don't necessarily always think it's a good thing, and maybe especially in this case. This might be a great example of why it's not a good thing.
It may have been a good result, but maybe
imagine, though, if they weren't ready yet.
Yeah, or even in this case, if because they were forced to move now, they're not able to capture the top 10 people instead of just the top one person.
But the flip side is I'm not totally one to just. I guess I want my cake and I want to eat it too. I want my certain leaks that give me the good nitty-gritty details that help me be a better voter, but I also want to protect security. And now,
Exactly.
Like in the past, a cable leak would literally be like a printed document that would be distributed, and now it gets mirrored instantaneously. I mean, it's like we are a podcast that has a link in our show notes to confidential government information that's now been made public because of WikiLeaks. I mean, that is nothing like that's ever happened before, ever.
Exactly.
So it's amazing. So an interesting tech angle on what is obviously a huge
it's got
story.
this spy angle in it, and
you kind of have a soft spot for the James Bond scenario kind of things.
Yeah.
Okay. While we're on the general topic area of policies and governments and things like that, the EU has made a few dumb tech decisions recently, and we want to touch on those because you guys, this is some stupid stuff.
Yeah. So basically, in the UK and Sweden, and most likely, by the sounds of it, the entire EU, they want to pass new privacy laws requiring each individual website to get your approval to store cookies on your computer. So basically, this is likely to end up resulting in every time you go to visit a website, you're going to be prompted with a mini EULA that you have to agree to enter the website.
Oh, wow.
That website from the government.
I thought maybe it might also be that maybe like people like us that didn't want to do that would just do something like if they're coming from one of those countries, just don't turn on a cookie. I guess that would suck though. You can't really do that. Things would break.
Yeah. So there's a specific provision in the law to allow for cookies that store the content of your shopping cart without asking, but that's it. And that loophole in right there just makes it seem like they kind of understood that cookies are important, but they kind of missed the point, right? Cookies are like an integral part of web applications, right? When you do HTTP, when you're requesting files from the internet, it's stateless, right? When you're on a website, you're not usually still connected to the website, right? You load the page
and
you're disconnected until you load the next page,
right.
And those two things are entirely separate. So the cookie is what allows the website to connect your second page load to the first one, so it knows that you're the same person.
Mm-hmm.
And usually the cookie doesn't even contain any information, right? With most times it's just a unique identifier so that it can connect all of your individual actions together into a session. And it's really the only convenient way to store state, and web applications can't work without it.
Yeah, unless I know that there's been talk of like maybe like coming up with some sort of common like SQLite database storage on for browsers. But
really, most of the information doesn't need to be stored on the client, right?
Right. That's why the websites have databases
on the client. They store it on their side because, among other things, it stops the user from tampering with the information that's stored on their computer.
So, do you think this is actually going to happen?
Apparently, the law comes into force in the UK on May 25th.
Oh, it's been passed?
Apparently. Now, the regulatory people that are supposed to enforce it say they're not ready yet, and so websites will have some time to comply. But
well, and how does it? I mean, they can't force me to do it. I'm not under their jurisdiction.
Right, and that's the other thing. It's like it's the internet. You can't have local laws about the internet. It's not going to work.
No, governments don't get that.
Yeah, it is. Part of it seems to be that the people that are trying to regulate the internet don't understand how it works. Right?
It's like when the U.S. shuts down, sites and things that it seems to me that if anything, they should only be able to, and I guess they do this now, but they should only be able to do it to sites that are in the U.S. and for U.S. visitors. They shouldn't be able to shut down access to a site for people outside the country.
But where does the site live, right? If the site's on multiple servers, maybe it lives in a bunch of countries, and then how does that work?
Well, and what do you do when you use a service like a caching service that distributes your content all around the world as part of its service?
It's like Scale Engine, for example, exists in 4 countries already and is expanding.
Yeah. Technically, the web files for Jupiter Broadcasting are not in this country, are they? In my country.
Nope.
So
technically,
there you go.
They reside in Canada in a much safer place.
What? Do you have anything else? Anything else you want to mention?
Things,
on that okay.
But basically, to solve this problem of advertisers using tracking cookies to be invasive.
Oh yeah.
Google and Mozilla have both come up with solutions from their side that are more practical.
Yeah, the Mozilla one is also being adopted by Microsoft.
Right. It's called Do Not Track, and basically it's a header that you include in your regular transaction with the website, and you tell the website and the advertiser, please don't track me. And then they're supposed to not use their behavioral profile information on you and log your activity anonymously instead of relating it to their profile of you. Right. And then Google's seems more like a whitelist system where you choose which websites to keep passing the cookies on.
Yeah, it's more work for the end user.
Yeah, but right now it only exists for Google Chrome, but Google's working on porting it to other browsers so that you'd be able to add it as a plugin to your other browsers.
The critique I've heard is that Google's is probably more ad-friendly, and that makes sense because it's coming from Google.
Yeah, and
go ahead.
Probably a little more work. Instead of just saying "don't track me," you're hand-picking the websites that
they're hoping that people just don't do it.
And,
as a website operator, some of the information that I don't know if tracking is the right thing, but like we use Google Analytics on our website. I guess you could consider that. It's behavioral tracking.
It not so much, right? When behavioral tracking is looking at what items I looked at your store and then changing the Google ads I see on other websites to be the same thing. Right? Like one day I went to a computer store online and searched for a specific kind of server.
Right.
And then for about the next week,
You get
every
those
time I
ads.
went to another website that had Google ads, it was that company advertising that category of product to me.
What I found interesting is I've been seeing on Amazon.com things that I've searched for on Google. When I go to Amazon, they come up as with recommended products that match some of the things I've been searching, which is really interesting that these two really separate entities, that's got to be, that's some sort of,
weird.
It's got to be.
One of the things is that browsers, almost since the beginning of cookies, have had what's called the same domain policy.
Right. No, I'm not saying it's a cookie thing. I'm just thinking maybe there's some sort of back-end information exchange or something. Maybe.
I don't know.
Because I know that the Google AdWords system, for example, it has the ability to be aware of who you are, regardless if you go to jupiterbroadcasting.com and then you go over to AppFail.
The ad code is loaded from Google's domain. So they can set one cookie that follows you to everywhere there's Google ads. But the same domain policy says that a cookie set by jupiterbroadcasting.com can't be read by appfail.com. Right?
Yeah, right.
That's a security feature mostly to prevent me from stealing your login cookie. But if both of those sites have the embed code for Google AdSense, then that code, because the files there are loaded from Google, that cookie can cross those two sites.
Yeah, and so they can kind of keep your ads consistent.
But it can only read the Google stuff, not the actual website stuff.
I wondered, Alan, do you know like this do not track stuff that the Mozilla camp is talking about and the stuff Google's talking about? Would it break things like Google Analytics for site operators?
Possibly. With the Google Analytics, all the cookie is doing is differentiating when you visit the website twice. If your cookies is the same, then you're a repeat visitor. Whereas if you deleted the cookies in between, it would think you were two unique visitors.
But they might be able to also work on that by IP. So this block, I guess my question isn't so much.
Right? A lot of people having being behind NAT and stuff. Like, for example, at the college, all 10,000 computers exit through the same 10 IP addresses.
Right, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I guess my question isn't so much about the cookie aspect of it, but just the JavaScript tracking aspect of it. Is there any talk of they're blocking that stuff?
Well, basically, the do not track thing doesn't block it. It just asks the advertiser to store your data anonymously instead of keeping individual records instead of linking your different things together.
I think that is absolutely fair. As somebody who has some really minimal Google ads on our site, honestly, the Google ads should be generated from the content in the website, and not I don't need people's private information.
Right. So when you put do not track on, what it will mean is that when you visit the Google ads at Jupiter Broadcasting and then you visit the Google ads at AppFail, if you have the do not track on, you will just see related. Your ad will only use data related to AppFail.
Yeah.
Whereas when it saw both and saw, all right, based on the fact that you went to both of these sites, your interest is probably more towards security and less towards exploring Mars. And so that might change what the ads are a bit.
Right.
But
I think just looking at the two different approaches, I like Mozilla's approach better.
Yeah, and the
obviously
thing is
Microsoft does too.
The advertising companies aren't forced to do anything, right? You're asking them politely to not track you, but it doesn't mean they won't.
So they're not going to. They're.
Well, I think the bigger ones will. The reputable ones will.
Yeah.
But the lower ones, these laws aren't probably going to apply to them well anyway because they know what they're doing is not what people want, and so they base their companies in, islands and so on.
I guess we'll have to kind of see what happens.
Basically, it's another example of the government trying to pass laws without consulting people that actually know what things are about, right? Because making people agree to accept a cookie every time they visit a website is flow breaking.
It just doesn't work. It doesn't work.
And there's almost no websites left that don't need a cookie for something. Right? If you have to log into the website, you're pretty much going to end up with a cookie.
Wow. I'd be really curious to see where this goes. Keep an eye on it, will you, and let us know?
But really, I think the law should be scrapped in favor of the proper technical solutions that people like Google and Mozilla have come up.
When especially, why go to this weird arcane doesn't work system when there's a technical solution that's already being worked on by people in their position to implement it?
This law is technically infeasible to actually enforce and make it happen.
Stupid. It's stupid.
Because how do you decide whether or not a website is tracking your behavior? Unless you can subpoena their databases and reconstruct it and see if they have more data on you than they should, how do you tell?
I guess we'll find out when Sony's record's coming out. Little joke there. Yeah. We're all going to get that soon. It's interesting. Any other thoughts before we jump on to the next one?
I don't think so.
All right. Now, let's talk a little bit about Nikon. Now, some of you might not be aware that Nikon has a image verification system scheme. Like it's some sort of, it's not DRM, right? But it's like an authentication system.
Right. It's basically like a GPG signing key. And the idea is that in their more expensive cameras, they market these ones to law enforcement and insurance companies.
Right.
And the idea is that when you take a photo, it's cryptographically signed. So what it does is it takes the SHA hash of the image and another one of the metadata of the image. And then it cryptographically signs the image to prove that, so that way if the image is modified, the hashes won't match and the signature will fail, and it'll prove so that when you run it through the software with the public key, it'll prove that the image has not been modified since it was taken by the camera.
So it's not like a Photoshop or something like that, which is why it's exactly important in a law situation.
It proves that the picture hasn't been altered in any way.
Right.
And that's the idea, is that for insurance and law enforcement, especially for evidence that's going to be used in court, it proves that the photo hasn't been manipulated.
So what's happened?
Well, because of the way the system works, the private key is physically stored on the camera. And so somebody was able to tear apart a camera and pull out the key.
Oh my gosh.
And with that, they could Photoshop a picture, sign it, and then the image verification software says, yes, this photo has not been modified. And in this case, the photo was the Statue of Liberty with the torch replaced with a sickle.
Wow.
Or there was one Stalin brandishing an iPhone, and the moon landing with the American flag replaced with a Soviet one.
Oh my gosh. Boy, those are some powerful ones to go with, huh?
Yeah. The security company was obviously Russian.
Oh, very cute.
So we have a little technical details about the way the system worked. The first thing is that they were using SHA hashes, which possibly is not sufficient anymore, right? With SSL and so on, we've kind of moved away from using just SHA-1 and using stronger ones like SHA-256 or 512.
Is it considered easy to crack?
Not necessarily, but this system's going to have to live for years, so you kind of want to err on the side of being future-proof, right?
Well, and it's kind of like we said on the pre-show stream. When you can go over to Amazon and rent a GPU cluster, you can accomplish a lot pretty quickly. Exactly. A lot quicker than you used to be able to.
Very quickly, right? Mm-hmm. And the other thing is the RSA cryptographic key they were using was only 128-bit. That's below what's considered standard now, right? All SSL certificates now have to be at least 2048-bit since 2009.
Okay.
And the NSA internal policy for government stuff is that a 2048-bit key can't be used for any document that has to survive beyond, I think it's 2016 or something like that.
Can you tell me something before we go past the way they did this thing? Mm-hmm. Each camera had its own key, right?
No, it doesn't appear so. In the Nikon system, it appears all the cameras use one single key that was stored.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Well, if we didn't learn anything from Dropbox, you don't want to have one master key.
Right, because in this case, this company is, and so all of these cameras are now, their main selling feature is useless.
So they pulled,
and there's no way to fix it. Right? The key is like hard burned into the camera.
It's in every camera and that has this feature. Now, but so they pulled the chip and they got the key that way. Isn't that also, do you know, now I might be getting this mixed up, but isn't that also the word on how the PlayStation hack was originally done, the way they bypassed the encryption on the PlayStation, is they just hooked up and they got it off the firmware?
Different, but yeah, they took the firmware update and modified it and found the address of the server that your PlayStation
Oh,
connects.
okay. So they didn't
And
do
they
like a
changed
hardware
that.
extraction.
No.
Okay.
But basically, apparently it wasn't that hard in this case to get the key.
Yeah, I've heard of a lot of copyright systems that where people can, if they have the right hardware, they can get this stuff. It's like it's on a
Right,
firmware
like-
storage device, and if you can read it, you can just grab it like a file.
Exactly.
Almost.
Like we're not talking about using like an electron tunneling microscope to get the key out of it.
Right. You just need to be able to read Flash.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just Flash that doesn't use a standard interface. Pretty interesting. So now Canon also got bit by something kind of like this.
So Canon has a similar system, except if I recall correctly from their system, the key is stored separately on a flash, like a SD card or something, or a USB device. So for their system, it might be possible to replace the keys that when they're compromised. With the Nikon one, I don't think it is.
Right, because unless Nikon could issue a firmware update and that area is updated with that, if
Possibly,
if
but
the-
I don't know if that's
yeah.
possible.
yeah, we don't. If
But basically, even if they do that, that doesn't stop somebody from getting that new key.
right,
Right?
just be the same process.
I've been thinking about this for a while, and I didn't come up with even a conceptual idea of how to work around this problem.
No, they're boned.
Well, but I mean, like, to replace it with a new system.
Oh.
I can't think of one, right? This is the same problem that DVDs and Blu-rays have, right? When you have to store the cryptographic keys on the device that you give the user, they're going to be able to get them, right? You have to, the cryptographic key has to be on the camera for the camera to sign the image, and there's really no way to stop people from getting it out of the camera.
Right. You have to
But
do it in a way
the worst
where
part is that Canon was told about the problem with theirs between 3 and 6 months ago, and Nikon's known about this for a while since the researchers told them, and now the company will even comment on it.
they almost would have to know when they designed it. You have to know.
Basically, if you just get to read the technical overview of what the system is, I could have been like, well, yeah, that's not going to work. Somebody's going to be able to get the key out of the camera.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at it like that, when you're building it up and you're buying the flash memory or whatever it is to store the key on it, you gotta look at it and go, we're shipping the lock and the key together, right?
Exactly.
I think they're betting
the worst
on.
part is that they're marketing this to governments and police departments as a way to prove things in court, and it's fundamentally flawed, and they know it. And
What about
they're not recalling the cameras? They're not admitting that the system's broken, or notifying their customers that, hey, you shouldn't trust our image verification system anymore because these Russian guys could alter the photos.
What about this? What about just having some sort of tested, audited, and verified app on a smartphone and using the smartphone camera? Now, before you laugh at that, if you guys see
in that case, how do you stop someone from altering the image first and then running it through the app?
you could only take one, you'd make it so that only verify if the image can only be taken with the app if it's going to be trusted. So it'd have to be the reason why I think is because then you could have a data connection and it could be some sort of service that is doing that part. So that way there's no key
right on the phone. But then how do I stop me writing my own app that sends a modified image to the service to be signed?
It's got to be that part's got to be, I mean, it's got to be airtight. And then plus you got to always be somewhere where you can take where there's a data connection and then you got to get a good camera on a smart. I mean, Jesus, this is a tough one.
I thought of a couple of different ideas, but I managed to poke holes in every idea I came up with.
It's really tough. It's really tough. And I think Nikon's probably just going to use an opportunity to sell more cameras, to be honest with you.
But mostly I'm just worried about the fact that they are not telling their customers not to rely on the system anymore, even though it's been compromised.
So what you're saying is the solution is everyone needs to watch TechSNAP.
Yeah.
Everyone's got to watch, so that way they are informed on this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we, unless there are any other last thoughts on this story?
No, that's about it.
Okay, now this next one is sort of an interesting follow-up, and I think it'll be our last story of the day. And do I get a little I told you so? Do I get a little all right, here it is. Amazon's recent crash actually did end up resulting in some data loss.
So with the Amazon failure last week, they've kind of posted their postmortem and trying to explain what happened and what they're going to do in the future to try to make sure this doesn't happen again. So the original cause of the failure was a network operator error. They were trying to route around a router to upgrade it, and they accidentally routed the primary network on one availability zone into its secondary network instead of routing the secondary network to the backup router.
Wow.
So it basically networked the cluster to itself, and so that cluster went completely offline and unable to communicate with the outside.
Honestly, what an ordinary problem to have, in the sense that it's just a route mistake.
Yeah, so like a typo or something took down an entire availability zone, which took out a large chunk of their capacity. It seems it was somewhere between 15 and 20%. So they have, 5 or 6 or so availability zones in the U.S. East data center. And so when all those went offline, the other availability zones, which some have copies of all the files, are like, all right, a bunch of replicas of the data just went offline. So we should make more replicas to make sure that we always have a couple of copies of every file. Because as I always say, if there's not 3 copies of it, it doesn't actually exist.
Right. Amen, brother.
Yeah. But this caused a giant flood of requests to replicate data, right? And this all goes through their back-end control plane system. But what happened was that swarm of traffic caused the network to overload and caused more nodes to appear to go offline. And it just kept cascading until there was no free space left in their cluster. Because when a node goes offline, that data gets replicated, but the original copies that were offline, even if they come back online, are not free space.
Right, because they have to be marked as safe to delete, and there's a certain retention time.
They purposely keep them in case something breaks, that they don't lose data.
Right.
So they ran out of available space. So then all these servers trying to replicate more were calling the control plane server saying, I want to create a new volume. And the control server was hanging, trying to find somewhere to put that volume. And apparently that API call has a really high timeout, right? Because they don't want to give an error and say you can't replicate that data, because eventually if you don't have enough replicas, then the data is not accessible. But eventually the long timeout caused thread starvation, right? They had no available threads left to service requests because all the ones they had were in use waiting for the timeout or waiting for more space to become available.
Aha. Wow. So the Amazon, I mean, when I think of Amazon, I think of and their back-end S3 infrastructure. I honestly just I have this image of unlimited disk space. Like they must have monkeys that just are constantly throwing terabyte drives into cages. So the fact that a route problem caused this whole cascade of effects that caused them to have a core issue where they ran out of disk space? Amazon?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, that's the first thing with the collab, is that they claim it's unlimited, but there always is technically a limit to how much hard drive space they have.
Oh, there has to be, yeah.
Yeah. So because all the availability zones ran out of capacity and new replicas couldn't be created, this caused the control plane server to hang. And so this caused all the availability zones in the data center to not be able to make API requests because the control plane was thread starved.
Ah.
So this took everything offline.
It was an internal traffic jam.
Yeah. So then what they did was, because those create volume API calls have such a long timeout and were causing this thread starvation, they disabled the ability to create new volumes, right? So when you made that API call, it would just immediately return an error, right? And so this managed to clear up that thread starvation and get the availability nodes that weren't broken back online, right? So they got, 70 or so, 80% of their services back online. But then other API calls eventually kept swarming and everything went offline again.
Yeah. What a mess.
Yeah.
So they actually ended up losing some data, which I kind of thought might happen. I think I made that call in that episode where we covered it. I said, major outage like this usually means they're struggling to get everything back.
Right.
Wasn't a significant loss though, right?
No. Well, it depends. It was like 0.07% of their storage, but when they store,
probably petabytes,
so many like exabytes or whatever, then that's a significant amount of data. but how much of that was backups and old copies of volumes and stuff, so maybe it didn't have that big of an impact. But some companies did have data loss, like Chartbeat, which is this online service that makes graphs of real-time data.
Right.
They lost about 15 hours of historic data.
So probably not going to end the business, but obviously sucks, especially when you're paying for it.
A black eye. It's embarrassing.
Yeah, it is embarrassing. That's too bad.
But Amazon has a huge amount of detail. It's a long read, but it's quite interesting. But I've summarized some of the things that they learned from it and what their plans are going forward. The first thing is rate limiting on API calls, so that no one API call can dominate the server.
Sure.
Right.
Twitter knows that one. Twitter knows that.
Yep.
Learned that one the hard way.
Another thing is to limit any one availability zone from dominating the control plane. Right. So saying, we have 8 availability zones. No one of them should be able to use more than 60% of our total control plane capacity.
Yeah.
Right. Keeping some space open to keep all the other ones online, even during one that's having a storm.
Mm-hmm. I do that in a VMware ESX infrastructure that I've been managing lately.
Right. Don't let one virtual machine take over all the capacity.
Right.
Right. Don't let it lag. Don't let one process lag all the other ones.
Yeah. Because if you don't put those limits in place, then that guy's going to ruin the party for everyone.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Another one is to increase their standby capacity to accommodate growth and failure. Right. They need more hard drives in standby.
Well, sure. Everybody does.
In this case, they lost a giant chunk of their capacity, went offline. So a giant chunk of their in-use capacity went offline, but also the associated chunk of their free capacity, right, when these nodes go offline.
Yeah.
So then they had to try to replicate all the stuff that was in use with less of the free space.
I see what you're saying, because all of each node, not only all of their storage is shared, so as nodes were going offline, they were also taking away from the total available storage, the complete pool.
So if they run at, say, 80% in use and 20% free space, well, when they lost, say, a fifth of their nodes, they lost a fifth of their free space and had to use up all their other free space to replicate the used data that went offline.
Right. What a nightmare.
Yeah. In the next couple of weeks, apparently they're going to buy a lot of hard drives.
This was a system designed not for an outage.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
It was designed to deal with this outage, but they basically learned a couple of things.
Yeah.
So one of them was to more automation for the network configuration. So you write out the scripts and have it happen all at once, rather than having someone at a console typing in commands, because it's the only way to make sure it's going to work first, right?
Isn't it funny? Yeah, it came down to if they could have automated that, I guess it would have avoided the entire situation.
Yeah.
The situation exposed improvements.
But it exposed critical flaws that maybe it's better to find that out earlier than later.
I'm sure they would have appreciated to find that out a little more gracefully, though.
Yes. Yeah. They would have wished it was on a small scale, like one little corner that nobody found out about.
Wow.
So one of the things was to get additional intelligence to prevent and detect these remirroring storms. So part of that was to increase the backup timers. So when you try to create a volume and you can't, don't try again immediately. You try again, and if that doesn't work, then you wait a certain amount of time, then you double that, and you double it, and kind of thing, so that you're not hammering, when not hundreds of nodes are not hammering the backplane all at once.
Yep.
Another thing was the backplane right now is shared between all the availability zones. They want to move some of the operations to a separate plane that's specific to each availability zone, so that a problem in one doesn't necessarily dominate the control plane.
Sure.
And affect other stuff. And it would probably decrease latency a bit too.
You got to figure they would have always liked to have done that. There must have been some either cost or some design reason.
Well, in this case, it's important that a central authority determine which copy, which replica is the authoritative one, which one's the live one. Mm-hmm. So you can't have that happen separately in each AZ.
Right. So what do they do for that?
That operation will probably stay in the centralized one, but some of the other ones that kind of just got heaped in there will get moved to individual ones.
Interesting. We're talking, it's at the top of the show. We're talking about Sony and architectural changes they have to make with their entire hosting platform. And now we're really looking at some major dramatic changes that Dropbox is going to have to make. And now we're looking at Amazon.
Yep.
It seems to be that a lot of these guys built systems that, I don't know, it seems like some of the stuff that's been built now, we'd already learned these lessons. So a lot of these people are now paying for implementing things and not learning from the lessons that have already been figured out before they did these things.
In this case, Amazon's is a bit unique just because of the scale.
And they're kind of a trailblazer. Yeah.
Yeah, but...
Yeah. But the actual cause of the outage, that operator error is as contemporary IT issue as it gets. That's as normal and as every day as you can be.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's kind of funny that this.
Obviously, and another thing was they talked about their backup network that everything's connected to has less capacity.
So it's not a backup. It's
like an emergency out of band.
It's a spare tire donut.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe that's not good enough. I don't know what the technical reasons why they have the second network not have as much capacity as the first.
Cost.
Yeah, probably. Another thing is they want to focus on when replicas go offline, instead of just immediately making new replicas, also trying to reconnect to the existing ones. So a small temporary network disruption doesn't cause this massive remirroring storm.
So there's some sort of built-in, not patience, but some sort of built-in sleep before it really kicks into action. Yeah.
So when something goes offline, try to reconnect to it first before assuming it died.
A good example is, I've had just testing systems or monitoring scripts where sometimes something doesn't respond right away and you don't need to set off all of the alarms. A lot of monitoring systems now have a built-in mechanism. Well, if it doesn't respond at first, when that condition is met, try again at a certain time and then alert. Yeah.
And if it fails 3 tests in a row, then call me.
Yeah. Don't wake me up in the middle of the night over nothing.
Yeah. And the nice one is the one I use, Nagios, also has what's called flapping detection.
Yeah.
If something keeps going into a bad state and then back to good and back and forth, it will, after a couple times, it will stop emailing me so that it doesn't go off every 5 minutes.
It says, I realize this guy's flapping.
Hours.
Not fapping, but flapping.
Flapping, yeah.
Different things.
Part of the reason why so many sites went down is they were only using a single availability zone. Right? If all your files are basically all your stuff, the customers were only using one because all their stuff was in one place. So Amazon is dedicated to educating their customers about how to use multiple AZs to make sure that if one goes down, your other stuff stays up.
Yeah.
Now, in this case, for part of the time, all of the AZs were down because of the control plane problem, but they were up for much more of the time than that one broken AZ.
First of all, okay, they're right.
Yes.
People should have done that. But second of all, that's expensive. That's one reason why most people didn't do it.
You have to have at least 2 or 3 instances running, so they love this idea.
And I thought it was called cloud hosting because it was, by its very nature, a distributed, a scalable being that could be out there, and I didn't worry about a data center in New York because I'm in the cloud.
If you're talking about an EC2, that can only really exist in one place at a time. So if you have 3 EC2s, they shouldn't all run in the same box.
Because it's virtual hosting. It's,
Yeah. So
it's not file storage.
Yeah. The file storage, the replicas exist in multiple AZs. But if you're doing an EC2, one's not good enough, right? If you need it to be highly available, you have to have more than one of them.
I don't think they have a competitive enough product price-wise to really be pushing that.
But if you need the high availability, right, it's still cheaper than having 3 physical servers, right?
Well, I suppose, because you have to pay for the hosting of those physical servers. But not much, man. If you're running an Amazon...
Well, the Amazon's price is not great. But
not if you run 24/7. It's good if you use it in spurts or you're using one of their micro versions. But, if you want to have a database server, a MySQL server for your website that's available 24/7, you're going to end up paying a lot more than you would just... Well, I guess it depends on the scale, but yeah.
Well, they have a separate service called RDS for MySQL clusters or MySQL servers.
Oh.
But that was down too.
Oh.
Because it uses the same EBS system to store your database.
Go figure. Of course. Yeah. Dude, this whole thing has like a great, fantastic breakout in the show notes. A lot of nice... You really read through that whole effing thing, didn't you? I mean, that was a massive...
Yes, twice.
Wow. That is something. So you definitely got
But
the cliff notes here.
that was really interesting to me, honestly.
Yeah, it is.
To learn those lessons, right? And the last thing they promised was to improve communications with the customers and the health service monitoring so that you can, their authoritative website that tells you whether something is broken or not.
Well, I guess this example of this big, long post they did is a good example of them improving communication. I mean, they were really clear on what happened.
But while those technical people were busy fixing the problem, there was no one telling the customers what was going on.
That's because they were too busy fixing the problem.
Right. But they need some communications people that are going to tell the customers what's happening.
Even if it's just it's stupid, but even if it's, their status page and some tweets or something, I don't know, or an RSS feed or something.
And so basically they're committing to updating the status page more and having technical details up sooner, because a lot of the people that are using the Amazon cloud are technical people and they would like an answer more than there's an issue.
Right.
Right? They would some explanation of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
We all thirst for the details, the juice of the story, right?
Especially when your site's down.
Faster. Yeah.
It's
you want to know exactly why. You want to know there's a problem and we're working on it. You want to know exactly what the problem is.
Oh yeah. Big time. Yeah. And I guess
that's the other thing with the Amazon cloud, unless you're paying huge amounts for their technical services stuff, their support service, there's no phone number for you to call. All you have is that little forum thing they have.
And
that wasn't really being staffed heavily while this was going on, right? So the updates were, hours and hours apart, and you're sitting there with no idea what's gone wrong, how long it'll be before it might be back up.
It is funny. This is a problem.
Whether there's going to be data loss.
In the age of, Amazon has, numerous blogs. There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's RSS feeds, there's podcasts. There's so many ways to disseminate information. To kind of clam up is kind of funny, especially for such a well-connected
company. In this case,
company.
all it was that all the technical people were busy and no one else knew what was going on either.
I've been in those situations before, and I know, a lot of times the argument is I'm too busy fixing the problem to stop
explain what the problem is.
Yeah.
But you need someone that's kind of in between.
Well, isn't that the role of a manager?
Probably.
Yeah.
I don't know. At Amazon, I think as the managers, like when I think of really heavy tech companies, like agile ones, like Google and Amazon and Facebook, I think the managers are more technical people and less manager people. And so I see them working on the problem too, but
who knows?
Maybe it is part of their job to be coordinating the communications.
Wow.
Get out of the trench and get some news over the radio.
So to recap, the PlayStation Network was pretty easily owned by, not easily, but totally owned, and had
it was owned in an entirely preventable way.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
Patch your shit.
And then
it's not that complicated.
We have WikiLeaks, who leaked information and had to speed up. This is all security stuff. And then you've got Amazon, who had an operator error. These are all really basic stuff. Isn't it funny? Isn't it funny that all this advanced stuff, it's all just kind of gets down to some basic human stuff.
And everybody thinks that won't happen to me until it does.
Yeah. Yeah. There you have it. That's the lesson of today's episode: is update your stuff.
Yeah.
Like Alan always says, patch your shit. Right?
Yeah.
All right, Al, is there anything else we want to cover in this episode?
Well, I think that's good.
All right, man. What an episode, and we'd love to hear your thoughts, so leave us a comment and feel free to join us when we stream it live. And also, we should mention we are inviting people to check out our new Facebook page over at facebook.com/TechSNAP, and we post, when we go live, we post informational stuff about the show, episode releases, things like that, over there at facebook.com/TechSNAP.
And maybe we'll put up some more polls over there, too, to try to
let's do that.
Get you guys to tell us, to steer us in the right direction of what you guys want to talk about.
And we're releasing new episodes. Usually Monday mornings is kind of the Monday morning time frame is what I'm shooting for over at jupiterbroadcasting.com. And in the show notes there, you can find RSS feeds and things like that, so you can subscribe to the show and get it automatically.
Yeah, I have epic show notes here, all kinds of detail, and links to even more detail.
Very, very epic show notes, so definitely worth browsing through them to get even kinds of more information than even made it into the show is in those show notes. It's pretty awesome. All right. Okay, Alan, well, I think that wraps up this episode of TechSNAP. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching. We'll see you next Monday.